Greetings and good Monday morning, this 8th of May, 2023. Still the third decade of the 21st century. I always open with that to sort of hyper-expose where we are, what sort of things we're contemplating, dealing with, and talking about versus where people had predicted us to be. So if you're new to my channel, that's why I always open with that. Secondly, if you leave a comment, I promise to read, react, and respond out loud on camera so that you know for a fact your voice is being heard. And then secondly, what I'm going to talk about today is two things. I'm going to read and react and respond to some comment, or well, one comment I got. And then I was recently watching Tim Pool, TimCast in Real Life, and he had Lance from the Surfs on, Seamus Coughlin, and is it Ian? Whatever. I apologize to whoever you are, Ian, if that's you. I apologize sincerely. I got to do the name thing like 3 times before I can get it right. It was tremendous. Let me get through the commentary, the reading and reacting and responding, and then I'll talk about that. So, all right, let's try to keep things in order because, you know, I'm a ginger and squirrel. All right. So Stace took the time to respond to my May the 4th video where I discussed making contact with a half brother that I had only found out about a couple years ago, but I finally had the balls to reach out and contact him. So Stace replies, I have a half brother who is 20 years younger than me. He was born 3 weeks before our biological father passed away. He and I do not have that much of a relationship because I had such a traumatic relationship with my biological father. My brother has reached out a couple of times to meet up. The last time I saw him was at our father's funeral. If I'm reading that correctly, you're saying when the last time you saw him, he was 3 weeks old? If I'm reading that correctly? He resembles my father so much that it's difficult for me. Before I move on, Stace, what I'll say is this. See if I can frame this correctly. Not to sound hypocritical, I'm not exactly in a hurry to meet my biological father. For 47 years I've lived without him. I've only known his name for just under 22 years. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to react. I don't know how to respond. I'm not overly in a hurry, but I don't know. I'm trying to learn more through my brother and potentially my sister before I make a decision on that. With that being said, you're talking about a child who was 3 weeks old when your father passed. You're talking about a child who's potentially innocent. Why do I bring that up? In the couple of phone calls I've had with my brother, one thing we can piece together is that there's some terrible animosity between the family in Illinois that I've never met other than over the phone and my father, and that it seems as though we, his children, have inherited all the animosity by no other reason than being his children, the sins of the father, so to speak. I'm not trying to argue what is or is not difficult for you. I'm not trying to argue your feelings. I think we do that a lot in this country, and we try to tell people how to think and feel. I would encourage you to try your level best to overcome it. Depending on how young your brother is, he might be in a situation where he could really use a sister. But I will leave that one up to you. That is entirely your business. I would just say, if you can potentially avoid typecasting and stereotyping him for some of your own personal demons and things that you justifiably have, but maybe forgive him who he was born to, maybe try that route. But at the end, obviously I'm not telling you what to do, I'm just giving you suggestions. My husband has similar cases. He has a couple of half-sisters on his father's side. He has a half-brother through his biological mother and a full-blooded brother, although they were separated when hubby was 2 and his older brother was like 5 or 6. one thing that my hubby and I have in common is that we were both raised by step-parents that were closer to us than our biological parents. I'm paraphrasing that, I'm sorry. I had two stepfathers. My mother was married twice. The first time was when I was 4 or 5-ish. It didn't last but maybe a year. It got me all the way through kindergarten, and then before I started first grade, he and my mom separated. I don't know when the divorce was finalized, but granted, it seemed like forever because when you're young, time goes by much slower, but somewhere around 6th grade, my mom met my last stepdad, and then they got married when I was 8, because I was in 3rd grade, and she was with him. That was 1984. They were together until his death in 2017. Growing up, I did not have a good relationship with my first stepdad, but that was short-lived. I had a terrible relationship with my second stepdad. We sort of mended fences and became more like friends than father and son after I joined the Marine Corps. Admittedly, he more or less said I just didn't know how to be a father, and while he was too terribly afraid to be more like his father, that's exactly what he did, is he became more like his father. So yeah, I guess you could say maybe I'm a bit jealous. Being children of our age, Gen Xers, I had the atypical, stereotypical stepchild experience to a certain degree. So I'll just leave it at that. For this next portion, I want to talk about the TimCast in Real Life podcast, where he had Lance from the Surfs on. Lance, who's a self-admitted lefty. What I liked about this video was that you had two opposing points of view agreeing to meet up and have a discussion and discuss some topics that are relatively sensitive. What I didn't like about this video is whether they agreed on the topics to talk about. They apparently did not agree on the direction. And not to use left and right examples, but there'd be a topic, and I'll just kind of give you a quick little list here. There was the New York subway incident involving Jordan Neely, where Lance wanted to focus on one thing and Tim wanted to focus on another. Then there was the abortion debate. That one was weird, and I'll explain that one. Lance, again, wanted to focus on one thing, and Tim was kind of like, no, dude, let's stay right here in the ballpark. Let's play baseball, not football, not basketball. In a weird, awkward transition from the abortion to LGBT / hyper focus on child trans, there was a discussion about freedom, where Lance was trying to advocate for maximum freedom. But I don't know if, because he's a lefty, he unwillingly participates in socialism. I don't know. But to a degree, like, his level of freedom was, well, I'll get there in a second. And then there was a large focus on the child trans, where I feel like Lance's major focus was healthcare, physical and emotional health. And, you know, Tim and Seamus and whatnot were coming at it from a different perspective. So I'm going to try to go through each topic for about 5 minutes, give or take. I apologize if this video goes longer, but I'm also going to include the link to the TimCast. It's 2 hours and 26 minutes. It's really good in the sense that you finally see people of opposing views agreeing to come together, and for the most part, they're civil. They get a little spirited, which I think if you're not, I don't want to call it idea dedication, but if you feel very strongly about something, I think spirited debate is bound to happen. But they were still very civil, and that's really what I've been advocating for. So, momentary pause, and we'll be right back. So, real quick, shameless plug. I don't do coffee. I just don't, because I'd have to overload it with stuff to get it to a flavor that I enjoy, and I have not learned to enjoy the taste of coffee. I use Optimum Nutrition's Amino Energy, just 2 scoops. I also include a packet of Emergency, and I also use 1 scoop of Concrete, and this is essentially my morning coffee. So, while I sip on this, so the first thing that they talk about is Jordan Neely. Jordan Neely, for all intents and purposes, was a man who most likely had some mental health issues, reasons unknown, sources unknown, was aggressive and violent and making threats on a New York City subway train, where 3 New Yorkers felt as though it was necessary for them to step up and intervene until transit authority or cops could get there to deal with it. As they subdued him, he eventually suffered injuries that would lead to his death. This has garnered a lot of attention, perhaps because there's video footage. I think what a lot of people are not wanting to say out loud, although maybe some people have, maybe I just haven't been exposed to it. I think the real issue is, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, Jordan Neely appears to be a person of color, and the people that were subduing him look to be 3 Caucasian males. So this has been getting a significant amount of attention. There have been protests, demands for justice, and essentially Tim was arguing that when it comes to the left and the media, that ultimately he feels as though the law enforcement entity of New York, both police and Department of Justice for New York, excuse me, woo. His concern is that they're going to succumb to the mob and go after these 3 individuals, one of which is a Marine veteran. I'm a Marine veteran, but I digress. Because, and as he was saying, there's been absolutely no outrage over additional crimes that have been committed in the subway system. Tim was hyper-focused on a woman being raped on a train in Philadelphia where nobody did anything, or 25 people being pushed in front of trains, I'm guessing at various cities, maybe New York. And one of the reasons was one of their friends went to go film or report on the protest and was violently attacked. So Tim was trying to make the point, why is there only outrage over this? And I think what they were all missing was, perhaps it's the optics. Lance wanted to focus tremendously on preventative measures through universal health care and so on and so forth. I don't know if they argued the point. I'm not going to replay the video, but if this gentleman had been arrested 22 times, protective custody would have been protective custody. But this goes, they go back and forth for almost an hour, where Lance was all about the health care. He makes some arguments about proportional force and, likes to use the word killed. And it's like, well, killed, and Tim nailed it. He goes, you're attributing intent. Killing someone is as a result of intent. Homicide is when somebody dies. So whether or not charges will be filed, I don't know. This one was messy. And this goes back to that point where Tim obviously wanted to focus on the hypocritical nature of the media and the left-wing portion of the United States, overly focusing on this one event while simultaneously ignoring all the other acts of violence, while nobody wanted to call out whether or not it's a lack of film footage providing optics or because the alleged perpetrators of those other crimes were people of color. And right now people of color are untouchable because they've been victimized for so many years, so that in the event a person of color commits a crime, it's a justifiable offense because they're just trying to get back what they've lost. I don't get it. it's such a weird dichotomy. And then Lance just continues to try to make the argument for healthcare, and at no point do I think they really argue the merits, because Lance never wanted to stay on topic. And I think, in all honesty, what Lance should have done was, when in Rome, do as the Romans. You're in Tim's backyard, so play by his rules. Tim wants to talk about the hyperbolic hypocriticalness of the situation. Stay with it and focus on it. If you have your talking points to argue, then argue those points related to that topic. Don't defer and deflect. And in my opinion, Lance was consistently deferring and deflecting on the basis of universal health care and mental health, and that, you know, something else should have happened to prevent this from happening. And it was just, in my opinion, it was extremely incoherent, while Lance does a tremendous job of articulating his point. I just didn't necessarily agree with the direction he was trying to take it. And again, you can watch the whole thing in its entirety. I think from my perspective, if I was to sum it up, Tim has a very valid point. For some ungodly reason, there's video footage of this. For some ungodly reason, 3 New Yorkers who are very likely not conservatives felt as though they had to act. And let's backtrack a little bit. New York State is one of those states that has a duty to retreat law. Kind of like 2 wrongs don't make a right. So if a criminal is engaging in criminal activity, which is notably already wrong against the law, people are not allowed to defend themselves against the criminal, because that becomes vigilante, that becomes wrong in itself. 2 wrongs trying to make a right. I'm assuming on paper, and the thought process behind it was in an attempt to avoid vigilante justice. I'm assuming there was some pure reasoning behind it, but like everything else, it gets polluted. It devolves from its most pure form. So essentially, an argument could be made as far as a prosecution is, why didn't they flee? Well, okay, where are they going to go? They're on a moving train. Are they going to go to a different cart? Mr. Neely could follow them to a different cart. So clearly they felt the need to intervene, and somebody felt the need to videotape this. And what we know is it has sparked outrage. It has sparked outcry from politicians, from influencers, you name it, all demanding justice, while at the same time nobody's addressing all the other atrocities that Tim wanted to bring up. Like, why are you so focused on this as a self-described lefty, and why are you not talking about any of this? The only thing I can come up with is video footage. That's about as far as I can go. And then I think what a lot of people aren't saying out loud is the outrage is all about optics, skin color, if you will. Yeah. From there, they move on to the topic of abortion. And this one was unique and weird, because I think I'm with Tim on many of the merits, and where I disagree with Lance almost to the point of absurdity was Lance's main argument, the foundation of his argument that his house was built on, is he believes women should have the ultimate freedom to control their bodies. Now, you can watch the video for yourself and tell me if you see or hear something different. I'm going to give you my interpretation. First and foremost, the foundation is Lance believes women should have the ultimate freedom over their bodies. In addition, and then we start to build the house on top of it, he believes that women should also have access to medical services, health services, legal health services, regardless. And this is a key point. Then, as he makes his case for abortion, and he believes that a woman should have the right to her body up to the point of giving birth, because birth is a choice. And you got to stay with me, this is going to get weird. He never addresses the child or the fetus as a child or a fetus. He almost addresses it. He essentially addresses, and this is my interpretation, he addresses pregnancy as a medical condition requiring a medical procedure that women should have legal access to. He does say he doesn't necessarily agree with the decision that some women might make, but he believes that they should have the ability to do so. Here's the area I can understand his approach. Lance was essentially making the argument you should have the freedom to make morally ambiguous decisions. I don't agree with. You should have that freedom, because what he was trying to frame was, if you have committed to this decision, like you're 100% sold. If you can't get it the legal route, then you're going to pursue it the illegal route, and the illegal route may have less safety protocols, less safety measures, where ultimately both the mother and child die. I get where he's coming from, and in that vein, I understand. Lance, if you for some reason watch my video, I understand where you're coming from that perspective. I disagree with how you essentially address and deal with the issue of the child, because ultimately what this long protracted argument stems from is the duration at which Tim was saying at a certain point, once the child is a child and no longer a fetus, once the child is capable of surviving outside the womb, there's a duty to protect the child. That is now a life, thus requiring protections. Lance does not make that distinction. He still argues that's a pregnant person, not a woman. It's a pregnant person. He goes back and forth between person and woman, because when it's convenient for it to be a woman's right, then it's a woman. When it's convenient to be a pregnant person, it's a pregnant person. So he kind of flips back and forth on that. Lance, disagree with you on that one. They try to argue the viability, and Lance, this is the part that loses me, because Lance never either understood or wanted to make the distinction that once the fetus is able to live outside the womb, if the mother does not want this child, there are measures in which the child can be removed, life can be sustained, the child can also be removed from the mother's custody and potentially placed into adoption. Lance completely disagreed with that, because what he would not say out loud, like, again, saying the obvious thing out loud, in Lance's mind, if the child lives, if the child survives, that is not an abortion. So in Lance's mind, the life must be terminated regardless of viability in order for it to be an abortion. So if the fetus is fully formed and grown to an extent where it could potentially survive, even with medical assistance, if it is born alive, if it is removed from the mother alive and it stays alive, that is an abortion. Or no, that is birth. According to Lance, that is birth, not an abortion. That is a birth. He tries to make the argument about most women making this decision do not make it lightly. It is a terribly traumatic event, and I understand that. If there's any concern about the health of the child, that there's something significantly wrong, viability of the child is bad, survivability of both parties is bad. I hate to tell you this, Lance, most mothers would choose the child over themselves, and it's happened significantly. I think less and less times does the mother choose themselves over the child, but statistically I don't have that data. Speaking of data, I'll get to that in a second. So where I disagree with Lance is I think he was overly fixated on the concept of having safe and legal abortions, which I agree with. I think he was not prepared to logically argue removing a live child from the womb and removing it from the custody of the mother, where the mother no longer has to worry about the child. It can go into adoption. Lance did not classify that as an abortion. And then they tried to get him to... Tim and Ian and Seamus, I believe, tried to get him to define what he means, and he couldn't define it. He couldn't, because he didn't want to say the obvious thing out loud, because they were trying to explain to them, they were trying to explain to Lance that in order to pull the child through the birth canal, if it's of a certain size and dimensions, that they would have to essentially destroy the physical mass. Oh my God, Jesus. Sorry, give me a second. They would have to destroy the physical mass into smaller parts in order to get it to exit through the birth canal, which is what Lance, I guess, classifies as an abortion. The cleansing of the fetus through the birth canal, where if the child was so large, because it was viable, that they did a C-section, Lance classifies that as a birth. If that's the traditional leftist view, then I'm a hardcore righty. If you had enough opportunity to shit or get off the pot, and you decide late in the game, and that's the point they were trying to argue, was, and Lance could not get it through his head that there's nothing wrong with the baby, there's nothing wrong with the mom, just at a very, very late stage in the game, the mom is just like, yeah, no thanks. And they even tried to say, okay, let's just say, oh, it's got green eyes instead of blue, no thanks. It's got red hair instead of brown, no thanks. But Lance, I think he felt trapped. So again, he stuck to his guns, which is the women that are making this decision late in the game are due to alternative circumstances as far as viability, and they just couldn't hit. And I hate to say, they just couldn't get to the middle. And I hate to say it, but I think I was completely on Tim's side with this one, where, you know, if the child has a chance to live outside the womb, that's murder. I have to agree with Tim on that one. This is where Lance begins to attempt to introduce data and cite sources. And this is where Tim could not, this is where Tim was more like Lance. Tim could not get there. He couldn't grasp or understand it. I'm trying to think of how Lance framed it. When a bunch of people do independent peer-reviewed studies, and then like another person groups all of that information together so that you can see all the different studies combined into one, I think that's called a meta-analysis maybe. Lance used it an awful lot. Tim could not understand what he was trying to say. Tim was hyper-focused on, show me the peer-reviewed study, and Lance was trying to say, Tim, that's what this is. This is 10 different peer-reviewed studies compiled into one cohesive analysis. And Tim couldn't get there. Tim couldn't wrap his head around that or understand it. And I don't know what Tim's educational background is. The only reason I know that is because I finished my last degree in 2019, so it's not that far behind. And I started a master's from 19 to 20, and I remember the meta-analysis, where there was a time and a place when you're writing a paper where you can use meta-analysis versus in the individual peer-reviewed research papers that were participating in the meta-analysis. A lot of times what you would do is you would find the meta-analysis and then find what peer-reviewed research they were sourcing as part of their meta-analysis, and then you'd go there. I hope I'm using the meta-analysis correctly. But yeah, Lance tries to introduce this, and Tim just could not get there. At this point in time, before they transition completely to the LGBTQIA+, with a very, very hyper-focus on child trans, Lance essentially made the comment about a lefty is all for freedom. One second. Now, he doesn't talk about it for that long, but my personal interpretation was that Lance apparently wants as much freedom and autonomy without rules as possible. Where, to some degree, I can kind of get behind that. You know, where, depending on what direction he's coming from. Like, again, to re-quote the band Stuck Mojo, we elected and appointed governmental officials to preserve and protect the human liberties that are already inherently ours. As a society, we enact rules because without rules and without laws, then we have utter lawlessness and chaos. I don't remember if Lance said that he's an agent of chaos and he wants chaos, but I don't know. Typically, from what I've seen, the left is all about socialism. So then they move on. It starts off with the whole Budweiser thing, and then it goes in a completely different direction where they start talking about the trans issue. And man, was there a hyper focus on that. And that's where there was a significant amount of time debating meta-analysis versus peer-reviewed research. That was almost comical to me. It's like, oh, Tim, you poor bastard. I love you, man, but you gotta get there. What he's doing is right. He's not wrong. I don't exactly agree with Lance's perspective. Again, with the whole trans thing. His major argument was gender-affirming care is not necessarily surgery, where if a child at a very early age says, hey, I'm a boy. So a young girl says, hey, I'm a boy. Or a young boy says, hey, I'm a girl. Then it is Lance's perception that it's now incumbent upon the parents to provide gender-affirming care, which can consist of any number of things. Clothing, toys, pronouns, you name it. He argues that the reason so many people are identifying as trans is because we're more accepting of it as a concept, so they don't feel as afraid. Okay. They had an argument about surgeries and hormone blockers, and Lance argues that no, it's not as profound as you think it is with explicitly young children. The minimum age is 16 and blah, 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 blah. And Tim and Seamus and Ian try to argue, well, hang on a second. It's not as isolated as you may think. There are parents that are waiting until the very early stages of puberty, which could be anywhere between 10 to 11 in some children, to start assisting them with their biological transition. And basically Tim's perspective was society and parents are providing the opportunity for lifelong, life-altering, irrevocable elections, where potentially being sterile, the inability to have children, having surgeries that remove the ability to physically enjoy intercourse. And Lance was just kind of like, well, show me this, blah, 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 show me. And that they got into this big drawn out argument over, the show me the research. But my point of view and my stance on it is this: children are children. We have certain laws that we seem to agree on: smoking, drinking, voting. But why the trans thing? Why is that so niche? That I don't understand. If a girl wants to be a tomboy, let her be a tomboy. If a boy wants to be a little more effeminate, whatever. If they say, children will say, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a rainbow. Leave the children alone. Just leave them alone. I think there's a fine line between indulging in their dreams and indulging in their fantasies. I don't know that there's any explicitly right or wrong answer. I think the world is filled with all sorts of research on good scenarios where parents indulged in fantasy and dreams, and there's equal and opposite research. The one thing they did talk about, since I brought it up, was if your desired outcome is this, then you're going to go ahead and cherry pick your research demographic to ensure you get those results. Case in point, if you're trying to prove the point that parents who indulged in fantasy and dreams had positive outcomes, you're going to actively seek out parents who had, children and parents who had that experience. And equally and opposite, if your desired outcome is to prove that parents who indulged in fantasy and dreams had negative outcomes, you're going to cherry pick that versus, I don't care, I just want to know what the information is. I thought that was a very interesting argument to have. But my perspective is this: leave the kids alone. As a parent, it is your job to try to make them a law-abiding citizen, a productive citizen, a productive member of society, one that at least understands a concept of right and wrong. And then after that, they grow and they make their own decisions. Can you still be available for advice? Of course, but to indulge in life-altering decisions that can have forever consequences at an age when they were not readily developed to make that. I mean, the argument is between 24 and 26 for women, and like I think 25 and 27 for men is when the brain is fully developed and you're able to make more cogent decisions. I don't know. That's my perspective. From a human perspective, I don't care if you're trans or whatever. I have no problem treating you with dignity. Matt Walsh said it best, and I know some people may disagree with Matt Walsh. You can identify yourself in any way you want. You can indulge in your own perception of reality, and you can indulge in your own perception of self. You do not get to demand that others indulge with you. And I think that's fair. You know, like, and I think the example he used is my adjectives are handsome, you know, and intelligent. And he's like, now you must accept that I am both handsome and intelligent. So that's my perspective. Holy crap, 36 minutes. So I'm going to leave the link in the description so you can go watch for yourself. The overarching thing was that two people of disagreeing ideologies came together and had a discussion, and I think that's very necessary. I think that's a point we need to get to. I think even if it does get spirited, I think maybe there needs to be a moderator, somebody who can control it. Like, hey, look, you're way off topic. You're way off topic. You don't understand what they're saying. Because I think one of the biggest one of the biggest cruxes of that whole thing was the hang up on the data, where Tim was like, he didn't understand meta-analysis, and I hope I'm using that right. But yeah, he didn't understand the compiling of peer-reviewed research into one coherent, you know, organization of data. So perhaps maybe in that circumstance, a moderator, to include a moderator and be like, Lance, you're way over there. Let's try to focus. Tim brought up this topic. Let's focus on that. The focus isn't the mental health and the healthcare system. So that's my thoughts. You know the deal. I don't care about the likes, the notifications, the subscriptions. I'm not in it for the money. We're just little people trying to have discussions. So if you leave a comment, I promise I will read, react, and respond to it. And if you do, I appreciate it. You're awesome. Till next time, stay safe out there.